Good afternoon. It's me again, Mike Head from Ethical Screening, and I'm here with Felix Odey from Schroder. We did the one before about agriculture and water from a themes perspective, as in what you identify and where the issues are. And the idea today is to look at Schroder as an investment house and also Felix as a person who eats the products of agriculture and drinks water, as he just proved by having a drink of water. So it's over
Cheers.
to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, as Mike said today, I think last time we left you with hopefully not too depressing a stage, which was laying out the many problems that the food and water system faces across water, land use, carbon dioxide, biodiversity impacts. And today we're going to spend some time talking about how we can actually counter and try and invest in a way that one identifies and two rewards the companies that are doing the most to trying to overcome these problems. And I think maybe as a starting point, before I jump into the kind of nitty gritty of what we do here at Schroders, and in particular with the fund that I help run, I think when we look at the companies that are out there, obviously we are talking about the public equity space. There is obviously the private equity space as well. And I think when I think about this more broadly, there's different roles that are going to be played by asset managers and private equity and us as individual consumers. Ultimately, in the public equity space, whilst it can be harder to really seek out those individual impact stories, I think given the scale of the problems that we face, it is going to be a crucial part of any solution. Because when we look at the companies that we're investing in, many of these are huge, huge companies, which means that if they can alter even a tiny bit what products they're offering, what services they're offering, and also how they are operating themselves, this will have a huge impact on the food and water system. So I think just important to kind of frame it in that before we jump into the kind of public equity space and what we're doing. But maybe going into that, and I think when we talk about our approach at Schroders with the Global Sustainable Food and Water Fund, we really talk about three main pillars when it comes to sustainability. Now, as I said, the first and really one of the most important parts of this is identifying the companies that are actually in the space and that can actually offer real solutions. So the first pillar, so to speak, is that universe creation. So the way we think about this is really in a couple of parts. We look at the entire public equity space and we look at the entire value chain for the food and water system. So what do I mean by that? That is everything from right at the top, the companies that are making agricultural inputs, companies that are making the fertilizers that at the moment are so relied upon to provide nutrients to allow us to generate the amount of crops that we need. It's the companies that ultimately help control pest outbreaks and limit food waste. It's companies that are doing technologies that are going into new alternative protein foodstuffs. It's everything that is really sort of chemically based. Then we move down more into the agricultural equipment space. So again, companies that are trying to enhance yields to ensure that with the same amount of land or even less land, we can continue to feed the world. Um, Within that, there's also very, very clever companies that are inventing new machinery and ways to essentially take the raw materials that are being produced by farmers and ensure as minimal amount of waste and a maximum amount of output from that. We then look at the companies that are getting these products to market most efficiently. So, again, we're talking about carbon, but we're also talking about waste because when you look at food waste, which is around a third of all food that is produced is wasted at some point of the value chain. If you can create cold storage networks that are efficient, if you can create fast transport, things like rail rather than truck, not only do you reduce the carbon footprint of food meaningfully, but you also massively reduce that waste figure. And uh, I'll try and I think last time I was coming out with a lot of stats, and I'll try and pick them carefully this time. But if you took all of food waste and you looked at the carbon footprint of that each year, it would be about the third biggest carbon emitting country if you put it in that rank. So these are huge numbers that we're talking about. So we've got the companies that are getting food efficiently to market. We then have the food retail companies themselves. Again, I think these actually play a really, really interesting role because, you know, what we've seen in the food and water space is government focus and regulation might come and go a little bit. But actually, the food retail names have got huge power in influencing the behavior of farmers and producers, as well as companies that are producing branded products. And taking the UK is quite an interesting example, or Carrefour in France. These companies have set very, very stringent targets across selling organic food and boosting sales there, but also in things like packaging. So switching to recyclable packaging, most of which have got a target to be 100% recyclable either by the end of this year or the end of next. So they're almost like that they've become almost like de facto regulators in this space, and therefore kind of crucial as part of this universe. The other area that we look at is the aftermarket. So companies that are taking waste byproducts from the agricultural space, be that things like slurry from cattle farming or livestock farming, or companies that are taking things like used cooking oil and then turning them into biofuels, into renewable diesel. Um, Likewise, we also have companies that are basically taking the packaging, so the food packaging waste, and turning these into economic revenue streams. So obviously, what we've seen in Europe in the last few years with the voluntary return scheme for a lot of different packaging types has been massively enabled by companies that are producing these reverse vending machines, as an example. And I can talk about some examples of companies we invest in later on. So and equally, obviously, on the water side, we're looking at that entire value chain as well. So I think the important point here is, one, that creates an investable universe that's broad enough that we feel that we can perform over time. And I will also later on go into why I think there's huge opportunities in this space, and why actually, long term, we really feel that this capital reallocation story is going to come through as shareholder returns. But it also allows us to be focused and really try to solve the full span of the problem that is facing the food and water system, because it isn't just coming from any one part of the value chain. It is an entire value chain problem that ultimately will need fixing from a lot of different sides. So that's the first pillar. The first pillar is that universe creation. The second pillar is assessing companies on non-financial metrics as well as the financial metrics. So essentially rating companies on how they are managing ESG risk, and how they are behaving as operators. As an example, you might have a company doing reverse vending machines for plastic packaging, but if they've got terrible labor relations, or if they aren't managing their own operations in a carbon efficient way, we need to recognize that, and we need to not only recognize that as a risk that can end up impacting an investment thesis, but also as a risk to them being seen as a kind of force for good in this space. So that's the second pillar that we really look at. And again, what's been fascinating in this space, having looked at it well, having invested for 10 years and looked at this space for about 5, specifically, is the data has got a lot better. So I think when I first started looking at this, and when I actually first started in the sustainability team at Schroders, it was very manual and very labor intensive trying to get companies to tell you exactly how they were operating, and even harder to compare companies on a like for like basis. There isn't one single KPI that you can measure companies on. What we've ultimately done at Schroders is try to develop systems that try and make these judgments a little bit more uniform. So things like SustainX, which ultimately creates a dollarized value by looking at all of the positive and the negative externalities that companies are generating. So what do I mean by that? If your product or service is having a positive or negative impact on society or the environment, we will look at dollarizing that impact. And it then allows us to essentially make the judgment of, for every $1 of revenue that that company is generating, how many dollars of positive or negative impact are they having on the wider world? So these kind of tools and really, taking the data that is now much more readily available one step further is a really helpful way of also having an overview. And ultimately, that directs us to our final pillar of sustainability, which is engagement, and really trying to have an impact through engagement, through voting, and through acting as long-term stakeholders for these companies. By having the data, we can see companies that are moving on the right trajectory. We can see also companies that aren't. We can see companies that are performing better or worse versus peers on things like carbon, on water usage, on food waste. All of that can ultimately help us to direct where we want to engage. And we try and split those engagements into a few different parts. We'll have ongoing engagements in key areas that we know aren't going away. So in areas where controversy has arisen, but we still know that this has got to be a crucial part of any solution to the food and water system, something like aquaculture and farmed salmon, maybe a classic case in point. Obviously, there's been a lot of documentaries highlighting the risks and the ESG risks that need to be managed by these players. Ultimately, when you take a step back, you look at the carbon intensity of salmon, you look at the health benefits versus the alternatives that are currently being consumed. It becomes pretty apparent that this is that there is still going to be a market for this, and two, that actually this is going to be an important market. Because whilst we might all like to think that everyone can go vegan or vegetarian in the next 5-10 years, I think realistically we know that it's going to be a struggle, and that we're fighting natural tides, because as countries become more economically developed, the protein per head goes up, and so having sources of protein that are low carbon, low land intensive are going to be absolutely crucial. So a classic case in point where it's a complex issue, but we recognize that the companies need to do better, and they need to show the public that they are doing better on how they manage things like local biodiversity. That's been an ongoing engagement that we've been doing for 3 years. And we have systems at Schroder's, a system called Active IQ, which we can essentially use to monitor, one, whether the company is doing what we're asking, and two, what progress is being made in absolute terms over time. So I guess that, in a nutshell, is our approach and where we're investing. And as I say, I think through a combination of identifying the companies that are offering products and services that are directly having positive sustainability impacts, but also looking at those companies that are setting stringent targets and are currently, a significant portion of the food and waters portion of things like carbon emissions. By identifying those companies, by pushing them to set science-based targets, by pushing them to ensure that management compensation is aligned with decarbonisation targets, all of that can have a massive impact. And we actually see that as a much more powerful way of ultimately driving the food and water system to adapt than simply divesting.
It's very interesting, because I don't think that when people look at an agriculture fund, that they think about the breadth of what it is that you're actually considering there. That it is everything from sort of the start point to the end point.
Yeah,
That stat around food waste is, I've heard that one before, and it's just extraordinary. That
yeah,
it would be nice when next time that somebody says, "Oh, I can't do anything. Why should we bother? We've only 1% of carbon." And what about India and China? That's the one that gets wheeled out all too often by the wrong people. And you think, well, what about someone should start pointing the finger at food? That'll be the one. Let's blame the food. Says the man who today discovered, when he was making some bread, that I had some sesame seeds that were eat by October 2018. I'm
it's
sure
quite
he'll be
impressive.
fine.
I
The
think
other one that's really interesting is the point you made about big companies, because I think sometimes the industry gets a bit carried away with, oh, well, this little company is making a big difference. And the truth of it is, a little company can make a big difference with its whole operation, but the actual, the sort of the global impact is quite small. And
Yeah,
when big actors make significant but relatively small changes, the overall impact is enormous.
yeah,
And as a consequence, I think, and sometimes they don't get the credit for it. Sometimes I
yeah,
understand they don't get the credit because they're frightened to put their hands up and say,
yeah.
look at us, because they're going to get shot down. But that's a whole other subject.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. And you definitely need both. And I think you need both from both a practical perspective and a kind of ideological perspective. Because, ultimately we're talking about companies being able to create economic models that allows them to make profits, that allows them to reinvest in R&D, that ultimately allows progress. But actually, it's true from an investment perspective as well. And if we, several years ago when we started up the fund, had decided we'd only invest in those small companies that were going to make a disproportionate impact, frankly, everything would have gone bust or nearabouts. You need the breadth so that ultimately the end investors can feel comfortable that they can have this as a portion of their allocation, and leave it for years and maybe even decades, and know that it's ultimately it's got both managed volatility and that positive impact story. And I think as a result, that drives the practical considerations. But I think from the ideological side as well, I completely agree with what you're saying. You need both. And I think what's really interesting about our job is that we're meeting all of these companies, and it's like a web, because we are investing in some cases in both the ultimate producer of an amazing product or service that's helping these companies, but also their customers. So we can really see these technologies rolling out in real time as we talk to the different parties.
Um, with an agriculture fund, do you look at ultra processed foods at all? Do you get asked about that by clients?
We do get asked about that quite a lot, and I think the answer here is that there's always a bit of a blurred line, because you've got the food technology companies. So again, not wanting to kind of drag out individual names that might end up having to be redacted later, but you've got companies that are the biggest companies in alternative protein yogurts, or all of these products, or stevia and sugar replacements. In some cases, those will be the same companies that are also feeding into kind of some of the ultra processed food. Now, I think what we are seeing is a massive shift for a lot of these companies away from traditional ultra processed food, towards healthier products, towards higher protein products, partly because that is what consumers want. And when we talk about this fund and we talk about this space, and again, I think we mentioned it last time, there's ultimately three drivers, which is economics, regulation, and consumer demand. And for a lot of these products, we see all three lining up. Regulation hasn't really been a driver of these things. At some point, it might be. It is not in the numbers that we assume to get excited about valuations. But I think at some point it can be a kicker to the space and help drive it. Um, so the short answer is we try to avoid companies that we don't see as having a long term sort of viable business model. So if something is in ultra processed food and it's completely exposed to being eroded by GLP products and Ozempic and Wegovy and the like, that is not something that we're going to be looking to invest in. But ultimately, if that is a company that has set very stringent targets on emissions on its products, it would fit into our universe. But we'd need to get very comfortable that ultimately there is a transition story there.
Okay, so that's the fund. What about Felix, the person who actually eats the products and drinks the output? Um, what do you try and do to sort of ameliorate and reduce? And have you sort of changed because of the knowledge that you picked up by doing the job, that you've had that slightly embarrassing, awkward, oh dear, that wasn't such a good thing to be doing, was it?
I think definitely. I think hands up, I was definitely a pretty heavy red meat eater. I grew up for the most part on the Welsh borders, around cattle and sheep farms, and always loved a good steak. Now I haven't completely cut that out, but I think one of the and obviously in the same breath, we were talking about there not being a single silver bullet and this being a value chain solution that's required. But I think if I was trying to draw out as near a silver bullet or several silver bullets as you can, eating less meat is definitely up there. And the stats behind that are pretty simple. So again, I think last time we spoke about the food and water system accounting for anywhere between 25 and 32% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, around half of that, either directly through the livestock farming, through the livestock themselves, ruminants obviously produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, so cattle, or indirectly through the crops that are planted for animal feed. It is 50% of overall emissions in food and water. So it's a huge number. Not only that, but when you look at land use, so around 50% of habitable land in the world is used by agriculture. Now, only 17% of that is producing crops that we directly eat, and of those, essentially, that 17% is producing 85% of the calories that we eat from the habitable land. So, in terms of just calorie efficiency, eating plant-based foods is massively more efficient, and it makes perfect sense because you've got fewer, to use the technical term, sort of trophic levels with energy loss and all the rest, and much lower waste. So eating less meat, not only is it been shown to be much healthier for you, but it is definitely the environmentally sound decision. Now, I'll give a bit of a nuance because, as I say, I don't expect everyone to go vegetarian or vegan. But I think the other way I look at it is in this, and this is different depending slightly on where you are in the world, but in this country, in the UK, we're quite fortunate in some ways that one of the other quite simple rules of thumb, which I definitely do a lot more of now, is eating locally. And that isn't, I think, for the reason that's often touted, which is people talk about emissions from, transporting beef from Brazil or lamb from New Zealand or wherever. If you look on a global level, that's not really, it's not as meaningful. So transport emissions are estimated between 3 and 5% of kind of food and water greenhouse gas emissions. So not huge, but the real impact and the reason why eating local works in the UK is because you are, especially in the case of beef and lamb, you are eating animals that were reared on land that, yes, was deforested, but was deforested thousands of years ago. You're not directly driving um, additional forestry loss, which is happening at a terrifying pace in Brazil, and in other parts of the world. In this country, 84% of all beef is raised on rain-fed pastures. So again, you're not using additional water that isn't available naturally. So there's a sort of simple and generally as well, actually the kind of animal welfare standards are higher, and the quality of the meat I think is higher. Now, obviously, it is more expensive, and I think one thing we haven't spoken about today is maybe food inflation. And I think ultimately we spoke about SustainX and recognizing the kind of positive and negative externalities that companies produce. I think that the truth of the matter is that we don't food prices today don't reflect the huge negative externalities associated with the system. Now, over time, either through regulation or actually through climate change and more disruption to the system, those prices will start to align. But I think making that choice, eating meat, maybe, eating beef or lamb in the UK less frequently, but maybe having a little bit more of a thought about where it came from, I think is a real silver bullet. And then the final one is one we've spoken about, which is food waste. This is a consumer problem ultimately. This is not there are things that the industry can do and are doing, but ultimately a large part of this is the consumer. Um, so really trying to, whether it's using apps or just, trying to really think about portion sizes when you're purchasing and ultimately keeping track of when things are going off. If you can cut down food waste, that is a huge positive impact, because it also sends demand signals, it sends price signals, which ultimately will help lower the resource intensity across the entire value chain. So I think those are the kind of three personal things that I definitely think about quite differently than I used to. And yeah, I recognize it's a hugely complex system. People will have very different views on this, but I think those are my own personal ones that I've picked up just looking at the data over the last few years.
It's interesting as well, isn't it? Because if you look, agriculture, if you looked at it, so we're coming at this from a different planet, you would laugh and say, "You do it how? Why?" That
Yeah,
doesn't make any sense at all. Either, I mean, I think people are always staggered when they see the level of the output in terms of greenhouse gas, and everything else. That agriculture is such a huge contributor that you know, I'm not suggesting that the oil and gas and coal industries don't deserve to maybe make a bit more effort or slow down, but agriculture sort of sneaks under the radar quite often with a lot of people because I suppose you get a bit binary about it, but at the same time, yes,
yeah.
you can't get away from the reality, which it is a very disruptive industry.
And I think what's scary is, on the current trajectory, the food and water system will use up the entire carbon budget that we have alone. So even if we decarbonize every power station, every vehicle, every mode of transport, if we don't decarbonize the food and water system, it will use our entire budget on a 2-degree scenario. And by the way, at that point, you will get huge disruption to the food system, which will mean it will become naturally more resource intensive rather than less. So completely agree. And also these are areas that are harder to abate and harder to shift in terms of technology. So it's why the companies we invest in are so important because we don't have time to get this wrong. And these companies will ultimately be the solution providers.
It is it is that terrifying, slightly doom loop thing, isn't it? That the warmer it gets, the more expensive it becomes. So
Yeah.
the more intensive it becomes, and the worse it becomes. And for everyone with really good hearing, that's the dog having a drink in the background.
Might join in.
Indeed, but it's water. Don't worry. Yours is obviously you've gone to the vodka glass now, haven't you? Why not?
Not quite,
Um,
even at 4 p.m. on a Friday.
even at. It's nice to think there's a time of day when that would have been vodka. You young people. Um, that's been great. Again, thank you very much. And as I say, it's very interesting getting this is what we're doing on the money side, which that was quite impressive the way you got all that out there without having any prompts or any slides or anything else. It's as
No,
if you've done this before.
once or twice.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much again. We will wrap it up there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, everyone.